Hello and welcome to Instant Insights. I'm Jordan Strzelecki, an analyst in Global Data's Strategic Intelligence team. At Global Data Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at quantum computing, including how we've got to where we are today with quantum, the major players developing it, the industries that will be most affected first, and much more. I'm joined by Bill Rojas and Isabel Al-Dhahir. Bill and then Isabel, could you please introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Thanks, Jordan. I'm Bill Rojas. I'm the Tech Research Director for Strategic Intelligence at Global Data, and I'm responsible for covering a number of technologies from Internet of Things to space, economy and satellite, semiconductors, next generation chips, and AI and quantum computing.
And hi, everyone. I'm Isabel. I'm a principal analyst in the Strategic Intelligence Division at Global Data. I've been working there nearly 3 years, and along with Bill, I lead many of our projects related to emerging technologies like AI, and also, as we're here to discuss today, quantum computing. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great, thanks, Bill and Isabel. Right, let's kick things off. So, I guess for my first question, just to provide some background context around quantum. So, quantum computing is making a lot of news headlines these days, even in the mainstream. So, in early October, we saw the 2025 Nobel Prize in Physics awarded to three scientists for their work on quantum mechanics carried out in the mid 1980s. And just a day before recording this episode, Google claimed another major breakthrough in quantum with a new algorithm that it ran on its Willow quantum chip. So all this heightened attention on quantum computing is great, but I think it's important to take a step back for a moment and explore how we actually got to where we are with quantum today. So Bill, can you provide us a brief history of quantum computing, including what it is? Because for many of our casual listeners, this kind of technology still might be quite elusive or confusing given the complexities surrounding it. And also, if you could touch on the major milestones to date.
Sure, Jordan. Thanks. So the story of quantum computing starts actually with quantum mechanics, which was created as a field in the early 20th century. It was Max Planck, famous physicist and scientist, that figured out that energy is not continuous, but actually it comes in quantized components, and thus the name of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a field that tries to understand what is actually happening at the subatomic level in the world of atoms and electrons and photons and neutrinos and all the other subatomic particles. And that world, the molecular world, the subatomic world, is totally different from our macroscopic world that we live in day to day. And it turns out that there are many very strange and unique things that have been discovered in quantum mechanics. For example, you can have two particles entangled. For example, two photons can be entangled, which means that they're in the same state, and then they can be separated physically. And even though they're separated physically, if you change one, the other particle will change automatically at an instantaneous time, which appears to be faster than the speed of light. And what's interesting about this is that quantum mechanics didn't assume that it was this way. It kind of turned out when they ran the experiments and they built the mathematics that this came out. In fact, Albert Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. Well, that was in the early 1920s, 1930s. When we get to the late 1970s, early 1980s, Richard Feynman wrote Caltech, another Nobel laureate physicist. He wrote a paper. It was kind of a thought of experiment, and the title of the paper was Simulating Physics with a Computer. Very simplistic. But in the paper, he laid out a structure that if you could build quantum devices that could do quantum things, then you would be able to simulate the physical world, because the physical world is actually quantum mechanical at the very bottom of everything. And he did not talk about how to build such a computer. He simply said that if you had it, you could do these things. And then a few years later, what happened is the mathematicians got involved. Mathematicians like Peter Shor, Grove, another one, and another mathematician and physicist called David Deutsch. And again, they didn't try to figure out how to build a quantum computer. Instead, they said if you had a quantum computer, you could break all the encryption codes. You could do all these things. You could do parallel searches. You would be able to do algorithms, calculations that are intractable with normal computers. You could solve problems that had never been solved before. Even if you had a million GPUs from NVIDIA, it still wouldn't work. And so that was the theory. So next came the building of quantum computers. The first quantum computer actually was built in 1998 at MIT, a joint effort between MIT, UC Berkeley, and Los Alamos National Lab. And you may remember in the mid 1990s, some IBM scientists received the Nobel Prize for high temperature superconductivity. After that, IBM formed a quantum computing group, and it has become one of the pioneers in superconducting architectures. But that's how it came to be. And since then, a number of companies have got involved, and we'll talk about that in the next segment.
So, Isabel, can you tell us the key companies that are involved in quantum computing?
Yes, so quantum computing, it's a very active space. And although the subject matter might appear very esoteric, especially the mathematics behind it, as Bill just described, our listeners will recognize a lot of the companies that are involved. So particularly big tech companies like Google and IBM, as have just been mentioned, but also Microsoft. These companies have been pursuing quantum computing for years. However, what is interesting about this space is that it's not uniquely dominated by large companies. There are many startups also, some of which are certainly contenders alongside big tech. So the startups, they tend to be pure play, and so they have the advantage of being able to dedicate themselves wholly to quantum. While the big tech players, of course, they benefit from larger budgets, but their priorities are more scattered considering how many pursuits they have beyond just quantum. And so when you talk about startups, I'm thinking first of the ones that have IPO'd. So these are Rigetti, IonQ, and D-Wave. These have experienced huge surges in stock price over the past month. It's positive news, but these surges are also indicative of a very volatile market. Quantum stocks were experiencing a similar surge back at the tail end of 2024, going into 2025, and it all came crashing down following some spurious words of skepticism by Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA. So investor confidence is still lacking, but despite this, the market is getting busier and busier. One of the startups, IonQ, has been on a roll this year in terms of acquisitions. I think 5 acquisitions in total, if not mistaken, in 2025 alone. Bill and I have market mapped all the players in the quantum space, both large and small, public and private, and we find there is a lot of differentiation among them by the quantum architectures that they're developing and also the industry partnerships that are being fostered. Actually, in fact, I would expand on my answer just now and say that the industry partners are also a key part of the quantum world. So banks like JP Morgan Chase, HSBC, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and pharmaceutical companies like AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, they are all pushing quantum computing forward in the sense that they are providing the pragmatic use cases and also the data to develop commercial applications for the technology.
Isabel, you mentioned there about different quantum architectures being pursued. Why exactly are different quantum architectures being pursued by these companies?
Yes, so when a company says they're developing a quantum computer, there is no one singular way of doing so. There are about 6 different ways or other architectures. So these are superconducting, photonic, neutral atom, trapped ion, spin, and topological. And if I were to explain how these architectures work, we'd be here for a while. But if our listeners are interested, Global Data has published a report on these different architectures, benchmarking how they compare to one another. So each architecture has its own advantages and disadvantages, and also each architecture is at a different maturity level. So in the report that I just mentioned, we benchmark the architectures against metrics like coherence time, gate fidelity, qubit scalability potential, connectivity, cryogenic requirements, and also commercial readiness. And since our conversation today focuses primarily on commercialization, it's worth adding that the superconducting architecture is considered the most mature. So Google and IBM, they're heavily involved here, along with the startup Rigetti. But being closest to commercialization doesn't mean it's the best architecture. For example, as a rule, photonic qubits typically have longer coherence times than superconducting. And what that means in simple language is that a photonic processor can store quantum information for longer because the system is more stable. And as a result, it can perform more operations. And system stability is something that has historically plagued quantum computing. So architectures that can provide that stability, even if their deployment is further along in the timeline, they'll certainly be attractive.
Now, there are conflicting views on the commercialization potential of quantum computing. So if we go back over to you, Bill, what is your opinion about the near-term realization of this technology?
Right. Um, if you had asked this question 6 months ago, the answer would have been 15 to 20 years. And that's exactly what Jensen Huang at NVIDIA had been saying. And then a number of things kind of happened. IonQ acquired a company called Capella Space, which is building synthetic aperture radar satellites. And also it has the capability to do quantum key distribution, which is a secure quantum technique to transmit keys, either through satellite or on terrestrial fiber. And then there was the acquisition of a company called LightSync, another IonQ acquisition. And this company, LightSync, is building something called quantum repeaters and quantum memories. And then they made another acquisition for $1.1 billion, Oxford Ionics. And Oxford Ionics has used semiconductor fabrication techniques to develop a trapped ion quantum computer, which, just like Isabel mentioned a few minutes ago, is quite stable, and the coherence times can last a lot longer, which means that more calculations, more logical gates can be computed before the states collapse. And so what has happened is there are three architectures that we believe are really vying for early commercialization. It's the superconducting systems, and then we have the trapped ion, and then the neutral atom. And when you look at NVIDIA investments, they are investing in those three areas. Ion trapped and neutral atom. The total amount of money that photonics that Isabel mentioned earlier, we believe photonics is right behind the neutral atom and the trapped ion. So if trapped ion comes out in, say, 2030, 2032, the photonic will be right behind it. PsiQuantum, who's probably the leader in photonics, they've raised over $1 billion from investors. And so these $1 billion level deals has got a lot of notice. And because of that, the commercialization is moving in faster because the intensity of the competition is growing. And just one other thing I want to mention about IBM, they have built 75 quantum computers in the last 10 years, 75. And some of these they've put on the cloud, and you can go to AWS for a quantum cloud or IBM or some other companies. So it's really it's a very interesting race that's taking place. And we don't think any one will be the winner. There'll probably be two or three winners in terms of the technology and the architecture.
Isabel, which industries do you see being impacted the soonest by quantum computing, and what can we expect that impact to look like?
That's a good question. I would say finance and pharmaceuticals. This is where we're seeing the most industry partnerships and pilot studies. So in finance, we saw perhaps the most advanced use case so far. You might have read on the news back in September the results of the partnership between HSBC and IBM, where quantum computing was applied to real-world bond trading. And it was shown to improve by, I think it was something like 34%, the accuracy of predicting the likelihood of a bond's actual trading price. So that was pretty exciting, and we expect similar examples to come to light from other finance firms. So JP Morgan, HSBC, and Goldman Sachs, they're considered to be the top three banks exploring quantum computing right now. So I expect some strong competition to reveal itself soon amongst them. In terms of what the impact will look like, it's a wide open world, to be honest. There are so many problems that are insurmountable with classical computing that suddenly become entirely possible with quantum. In pharma, we'll be seeing quantum applied to molecular modeling and simulating complex drug interactions. which is then necessary for achieving the often repeated goals of personalized medicine and novel drug discovery. And this would be critical for areas like cancer therapeutics, but also, for example, coming up with new antibiotics to confront the growing global issue of antibiotic resistance. And then similarly, this application of molecular modeling rather could be extended to any industry related to material science. So automakers like Hyundai, Volkswagen, I think also Mercedes-Benz, they're exploring quantum computing to obtain a better understanding of electric vehicle battery chemistries. And then other sectors like finance, but really any industry where masses of data are needed to be analyzed, make predictions, optimizations. This is again where quantum computing will really prevail over today's classical systems.
Now, if we go back to you, Bill, what will be quantum computing's impact, if any, on AI?
Right. So I think we can reword that question as what is the relationship between AI and quantum? And it goes both ways. Uh, One of the reasons that NVIDIA is very excited about quantum these days is because they are partnering with quantum computer companies and they're putting their NVIDIA servers, supercomputers, next to the quantum computer and essentially setting up a configuration which is called a hybrid configuration. So what the way that works is if you have an algorithm, maybe data sets that need to be pre-processed, you run it through the NVIDIA or the supercomputer, we'll call it the classical supercomputer first. Then you feed that output to the quantum computer and you solve particular problems with that. The output is then sent back to the classical computer, which will then make more adjustments and around the iteration goes. So the classical quantum computer configuration is very, very powerful. And it's one of the reasons that the field is moving so fast because we're not ignoring classical computing. We're simply saying, let's take advantage of all the resources that we have and bring them together. Now that we've said that, let's kind of go back for a second and ask ourselves, how can quantum influence AI? So what is AI actually in this context, right? It's the ability of computer systems to perform tasks that require human intelligence, such as learning, problem solving, decision making, and reasoning. Now, how is this done? Well, it's done by essentially building these very large matrices and processing natural language text into mathematical vectors and applying weighting functions to it, right? And that's how a foundation model works today. What if the quantum computer were to do the same, but instead of using graphical processors, you would use the parallel capabilities of quantum computer? So in theory, it does appear that it would be possible to calculate some of these matrices very, very fast, much faster than it can be done on a classical computer. And if that happens, if that can be done, then what's going to end up happening is that the AI systems will be able to run much faster, and that by shortening the time, you're going to actually get an effect that will appear to have more intelligence. So if there is a way to build super intelligence, quantum AI running on a quantum system could be the way. And that is the thinking that a number of laboratories have. And it may be the reason that Google calls their quantum laboratory, they don't call it Google Quantum, they call it Google Quantum AI Lab.
Obviously, we've already touched on how the near-term commercialization of quantum seems to be accelerating. But once quantum computing is more mature, there is understandable concern over its ability to very easily and quickly break today's encryption protocols, exposing masses of sensitive data. Bill, what is being done to mitigate this threat?
Right. So the industry, and we're going back 4 or 5 years, led by organizations like the National Institute of Standards in the US, NIST, and similar organizations in the UK and Europe and China, realized that the Q day, the quantum day, Q day is the day when quantum computers can finally break the codes sometime in the future. That day is coming. It's not 100 years from now. It's not 50. It's probably less than 20 years. And if that's the case, what can be done? So these regulatory organizations, standards organizations, put out a request for ideas. And so various research labs around the world submitted proposals, and they selected the top four proposals in the case of the United States. China has its own, Korea has its own proposals as well. And this group of algorithms is called post-quantum cryptography. It's not quantum, it's actually cryptography, but it's a very, very difficult, much more difficult than the current public key cryptography that we have today, to make it harder for quantum computers to break. I don't think we can say that it's impossible that the quantum computer could not break it in the future, but certainly for a few years it's going to delay matters, and the data will be protected, and that's called PQC, or post quantum cryptography.
So for our final question, I wanted us to touch on whether you both think there will be a quantum boom similar to what we saw with generative AI in light of OpenAI's release of ChatGPT. So Isabel, if we start with you and then go back to you, Bill.
Yes, so until maybe last year or the year before, people were talking about a quantum winter, or a disillusionment phase where people didn't take the technology very seriously. Or at least it seems so futuristic that no one could take it seriously in the present moment. However, and I think Bill would agree with me here, but I'm curious to hear what he thinks afterwards. We have now left that winter phase, and I don't think we will be returning to it. So earlier in this podcast, we already expanded on the various pilot use cases and success stories, which are gaining in frequency and complexity every few months, even every few weeks. As Bill just explained, the threat of today's encryption standards being torn up by a quantum computer as easily as tearing a piece of paper. This threat has caused a lot of concern, and in the US, post-quantum cryptography is being mandated in the next decade or so for certain domains related to national security. So there are a lot of indications that support our confidence that we are firmly out of that winter phase. So quantum computing is coming soon. We are predicting from about 2030 that quantum computing will be found within not just these pilot studies, but within operational or commercial at-scale applications. And at this point, we might well see a boom. The difference with quantum computing is that the hype probably won't be consumer-led. Generative AI was very much influenced by the mass marketability of it, while quantum computing is or will likely be restricted amongst enterprise use. And even then, it would be quite niche, or it would be used within quite niche areas where classical computing falls short. So the hype or the boom will depend upon investors and potential industry adopters understanding just how powerful the technology can be and what problems it will be able to solve.
I agree with Isabel that we're not going back to a quantum winter or disillusionment, a period of disillusionment. I guess to put it in context, AI research started in the early 1950s, and it took 75 years, 73 years to get to the ChatGPT moment, and 75 years to get to the DeepSeek moment. Quantum computers, the first quantum computer was built in, like I said earlier, 1998. It was a 2-qubit computer. Since if we use Richard Feynman's paper as the beginning of the timeline, then we are at roughly 43 years. So it's still very very young. However, it's based on the physics that was developed in the early 1900s. So the science and the physics and the math behind it actually date back to 100 years. The mathematical algorithms go back about 30 years, and they're very solid, very sophisticated algorithms. And so the foundation is very solid. The commercialization then comes to, can you scale? Can you solve the noise problems? Can you get the stability? And one of the very interesting trends that we're seeing is the semiconductor foundry companies like Global Foundries. They're tying up with the quantum companies to build the chips for them, which are quantum chips, but it's using semiconductor processing. And so because of that, we're pretty optimistic that we are going to be looking at a continued period of growth, and there'll be probably a lot more surprises in milestones and announcements.
Thank you. Now, that's all, unfortunately, we have time for. Thank you, Bill and Isabel, for joining today's podcast on quantum computing, as well as our listeners for tuning in. If you have any questions or want to get in touch with our team at Global Data Strategic Intelligence, you can reach out at customersuccess.strategic@globaldata.com. Thank you once again for listening and see you next time.